With the expansion for Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree coming up, I've been thinking about FromSoft games again. After playing Elden Ring, I was kind of frustrated with the endgame, as indeed a lot of people I think were. The game is undeniably great, but it does suffer towards the end, and not feeling entirely satisfied with the end of Elden Ring, and especially the Elden Beast fight, I decided to go straight into playing Sekiro for the first time right after Elden Ring. Sekiro is great, but it did kind of sap some of my enthusiasm for the studio's games. Sekiro is by far the most difficult game I have ever played, and I think it's the only game I have ever played where I felt like it is inevitable that I will be too old to be physically fast enough in my reactions to complete it. A lot of games are difficult in a way where it requires knowledge, planning, and knowing the levels to be good at it. But Sekiro is hard in a way that, say, sports are, where you need to have the hand-eye coordination in some fights to be able to do it. Now, I'm not very old. I'm not saying that I'm destined to, in 2 years' time, never be able to complete Sekiro again. But, you know, when I get up there in my 60s and 70s, when I retire, I won't be able to beat Sword Saint Ishin, and, you know, that's not the end of the world. I bring this up to talk a bit about why I've been less enthusiastic about some of the FromSoft games, and that's their approach to difficulty. As with many other people, I loved the original Dark Souls. I think it's my favorite of the FromSoft bunch, and I have to say I've been a bit dismayed with the way the games have gotten harder over time. I found that some of the fights in Dark Souls 3 were difficult to a point where they got much more frustrating than they ever were before, and that's a pattern the studio has kept up, mostly on the fringes, the optional bosses, the DLC content, but it certainly has been moving in the direction of being more difficult, and I think that's a natural way for the studio's games to evolve. They're known as the hard games, which only real gamers, whatever that is, can complete. And naturally, if a lot of people play your difficult games enough, what was once really difficult becomes less so, and you need to move your positions forward in order to capture the same level of difficulty again for a hardened audience. Thing is though, I am not one of the hardened audience members. I am one of the people who has played every major FromSoft game in the Dark Souls style, except Demon Souls, exactly once, and I've never completed the DLC for any one of the games. I may not be the target audience for some of these games, but I am, I think, a pretty representative sample for how most people play them. I don't know the in and outs of the Artorias fight, and I never beat the Fume Knight. I am one of the hundreds of thousands of players who pick up a FromSoft game and play it until it gets boring. The difference is, unlike a lot of those players, I have finished every of the games, and in some cases that's for the worst. I do think that quitting Elden Ring around Lane Dell is probably the best way to have a good time with the game, because it does unfortunately get worse after that. I'm therefore a bit worried about Shadow of the Erdtree because I think it will once again be more difficult than the base game. That's what you would expect from an expansion, but when the base game is already so difficult in ways that I don't find very fun. For example, the Lord Moog fight is one I never completed because I just couldn't get through it, or rather, I didn't dedicate the time needed to get through it given his unskippable attack. That's the kind of design that was once off limit for the studio, that is now needed because the hardcore audience have gotten so good that sometimes you need to throw in these sorts of cheap shots in order to get him a real challenge. FromSoft doesn't need to bring out the big guns to challenge me, and therefore, I don't think the level of challenge Shadow of the Erdtree and their games going forward is calibrated for me and players like me. and you need a casual audience for any sort of game to become big. Unlike Paradox games, you don't have 7-year post-launch development cycles with 22 paid DLCs for FromSoft games. They need to have the regulars as well. Time will tell if these fears are validated or if it's just a great expansion that has none of the problems the base game did. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it is not. But while on the topic of FromSoft, I have another reason that I've been somewhat less enthusiastic about the studio. When playing Sekiro right after Elden Ring, I started to notice some of the similarities of the FromSoft house style, or possibly even the Miyazaki style, which to me felt odd. Pretty much every one of the Dark Souls style games ends in fire. That's fine for Dark Souls 1 and 3, that's part of the motif, but when it also crops up in Bloodborne, in Sekiro, and in Elden Ring, you start wondering if it's there for the sake of being there, or if it's there to serve a purpose. Similarly, most of the game have some sort of reflection of the hub area that you can find in the world. When you do that in Bloodborne, I thought it was really cool and it really said something about the world. But when I found that same sort of mirrored hub in Elden Ring, I thought, why is this here? What does this say, and what am I supposed to take from this? It feels like a detail that is part of the Miyazaki style and therefore has to be in the game rather than saying something. Now, to be fair, I'm not a big lore buff. Maybe there are some perfectly good reasons why it's there. Maybe if I read all the item descriptions, it would have made perfect sense, but that's kind of another point that frustrated me with Elden Ring after Sekiro. People love debating online about what different FromSoft game stories are about and what they mean, and about which of the games is the best story. I would argue though that Sekiro is the only real story they've told, because it's the only story where there are major characters that make decisions that drive the plot forward. Everything that happens in the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring has already happened. We're just walking through the ruins, seeing what the real characters did long before the story is now set. That style of storytelling can work, but we've done this before. Just like we've done Poison Swamps, just like we've done The Lady That Helps You Level Up, just like we've done Patches. I don't mean to be all negative, I like these games a lot, but playing them back to back was a worse experience for me than spacing them out when I could forget some of the incredibly specific details that repeat. It's sort of ironic. The major theme that these games keep ruminating on is stagnation, and in some sense, it's a bit of stagnation to keep reusing the same, specific studio tropes that keep coming up again. Now, I'm sure there are other people who have been talking about this, but stagnation makes a lot of sense for a man in his 40s or 50s in Japan to talk about, remembering what it was like in the 80s and what it was like afterwards. I'm not against exploring the same themes over and over again. It's just that it feels less like a new take on the same story and more like trying to retell the same story in many cases, except this time for real. Now, I don't want to come across as too harsh. Like I said, I really like these games and they are meaningfully different in most ways, but sometimes I wish they would take a bit more of a creative risk on a project, maybe nix some of the weird fixations like the Poison Swamps in upcoming games to make them feel a bit more distinct. I hope Shadow of the Erdtree is great, I really do, and if it gets good reviews I might play it. Will I finish it? I mean, probably not given my track record, but it's in everyone's best interest to get more good games and more good expansions, and an expansion can do a lot for a game. The central point in this video I'm trying to make is that, at least for me, even though Elden Ring was at points amazing, the studio have some things to prove. I'm very glad to see that Lies of P was so well received, because I think it's exactly the sort of competition that will make the Souls-like genre more innovative, more creative, you know, to get a bit of new life. I've yet to play Lies of P. Maybe I would have the same sort of critiques there, with incredibly niche and specific Souls-like tropes to pop up again and again. Maybe this is being annoyed by staples of the genre. If I get around to playing Lies of P and make a video about it, I guess we'll discuss that. But I am very glad that someone else can compete on this sort of ground, because as good as FromSoft are, and again, they are very, very good. Like, they made the Twin Princes fight, they made Lady Maria of the Clock Tower, they made Orange Demon Smell. Like, let's not kid ourselves, they're really good at what they do. But maybe looking at another game that does the same sort of thing as well will give them inspiration. Maybe we're entering a golden age of Souls-like. That's what I would hope, but we'll see. With all that said, I am still hyped for the next thing FromSoft makes if it's a Souls-like, especially if it's one of the more spin-off-y ones like Bloodborne or Sekiro. I think they are at their best when they're experimenting, which is sort of what I'm clumsily trying to say here. Elden Ring is great, but it can be a bit too safe. It imports so much of Dark Souls that I think it should be called Elden Soul or Dark Ring or Souls Ring or something, you know what I mean? Like, it's clearly in the same franchise even though we have a new setting. FromSoft kind of dominated a lot of the gaming discussions in the 2010s and into the early 2020s for good reason. But if they want to keep their crown, if they don't want to end up falling from grace the way Bethesda recently did, I think what they really need to do is take some more creative risks, not just keep redoing Dark Souls 1 in different variations. And I think they also need to, as I talked about in the beginning, to make sure to get the difficulty right for the medium player, not for the hardcore player. Are you excited for Shadow of the Erdtree? Let me know in the comments, and I'll hopefully be back next month. Karluigi out.